Rizwan Virk, welcome to the 86th episode of NEOHUMAN podcast.
Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. How are you doing in California with the pandemic and this crazy world that we're living in right now?
Well, things were actually pretty calm, where I am. California obviously has its set of problems, always related to wildfires, especially today. We've got all kinds of haze from fires all over the Bay Area. But it just started yesterday. There was a little bit of lightning, and I guess it set some places on fire. But other than that, I actually live right down the road from Google. And it's actually been quite calm because their 40,000 employees have been staying at home. So this area, as I said, hasn't been too crazy.
Mm. Let's start with your background, the work you've done, the lives you've lived, and what are you mainly focused on now these days?
Sure. So, I got my degree in computer science many years ago from MIT and became an entrepreneur in the software industry. Started off doing a bunch of enterprise software, kind of boring stuff for some people. Big IT departments used our product, thousands of them. And then after selling my last enterprise software company almost 10 years ago, I moved out to Silicon Valley and got involved with video games. And that was around the time that Facebook had released games on its platform. And also the iPhone had come out in 2007. And in 2008, they introduced the App Store. And so I got heavily involved in kind of this nascent industry, which was mobile gaming, with a company called Tapjoy, which became one of the biggest advertising companies in mobile. And we made a game called Tapfish, which was one of the top games in the early days of the App Store. We ended up selling that to a big Japanese company, and then I became more of an investor and mentor and advisor to different startups. And then, a few years ago, I went back to MIT and started Play Labs, which is a startup accelerator for playful technologies, and also decided to focus a little more on my writing. And so, I came out with the book, The Simulation Hypothesis, last year on the 20th anniversary of the release of The Matrix, which was March 31st, 1999. And my book was released on March 31st, 2019,
Amazing.
last year. Yeah. And so now, I'm involved in a combination of kind of futuristic types of activities around virtual reality. Also, I'm an investor still in many different startups. I'm writing new books, and kind of it parallel with my journey in the software world. I was an explorer of many states of consciousness, whether it was to meditation, Tibetan dream yoga, lots of other practices. And so I became interested in consciousness and how it interacts with the physical world. And so, the book, The Simulation Hypothesis, was a way of tying all of that together, really, for me, for areas that I've investigated over many years.
That's awesome. And it really is this combination of consciousness and simulation hypothesis that you're talking about that interested me initially about, I thought I need to talk to him. And you also have a new book called Startup Myth and Models, What You Won't Learn in Business School. I want to talk to you about that a little bit later, but let's start with the simulation hypothesis. And MIT computer scientist shows why AI, quantum physics, and Eastern mystics all agree we are in a video game. Can you describe the thesis of the book and what interested you beside Matrix to write the book in the first place?
Yeah, well, a few years ago, I was heavily involved in virtual reality startups. And so I was actually visiting one of them, and they had a VR ping pong game that was going to be released by HTC, who are makers of the Vive headset, which was one of the big headsets along with Oculus, when virtual reality was sort of making a comeback. And so as I was playing this ping pong game, I found that it was so realistic in terms of the responsiveness that I forgot I was in a virtual reality, so much so that at the end of the game, I decided to put the paddle down on the table and lean against the table. Of course, there was no table. I was just in a room with these goggles on. And so the controller fell to the floor and I almost fell over.
And how long
And
did
so
it take from the time that you start playing the game to being convinced that you're basically in that environment?
it didn't take very long. I mean, these were relatively short games, so it was less than 10 minutes total
Hmm.
that I was playing. And what's interesting about that is that it wasn't even the resolution. So, in when we talk about the Matrix, we think of super high resolution virtual worlds, which look just like the physical world. And we'll talk about how we get there. But in this case, the resolution graphics were not that realistic. It was more the physics engine. It was the way that, I heard the sound of the ball as just when I was about to tap it, and depending on where I tapped it, it went and it reacted based upon how I hit it. And so really the responsiveness was actually the key to this immersion, more so than what we think of, which is the pixel resolution. Turns out that we have pretty good pixel resolution already. I mean, most movies you see at the when we had cinemas open, right? Like, Star Wars or Blade Runner 2049, they're digital these days, and they get sent at a 2K pixel resolution. Well, it turns out, we have 4K resolution screens and 8K on the way. And so we're getting very good at getting the pixel resolution, but it was really that responsiveness. So I started to think, well, what would it take, for technology to develop to what I call the simulation point, which is the point at which we can produce simulations that are so realistic that we would not be able to distinguish those from physical reality. Completely immersive, like the Matrix, really. And so that was how I started writing the book. But then, as I started to investigate this idea, I realized that it was being taken, seriously now. Whereas 20 years ago, when the Matrix came out, it was considered science fiction. And, before that, the works of Philip K. Dick, were very inspirational to the makers of the Matrix, but also in providing a framework in science fiction to talk about the idea that what you're seeing might not be real, that there may be invented worlds or false memories, for example. And so, that led to the writing of the rest of the book. And part of the book really delves into the idea that this isn't a new idea, that all the world's religions have been talking about this for some period of time. And so I was able to kind of tie that together as well.
Very interesting. I'm glad that you mentioned the effect of sound, because I'm coming from the background of sound design. And I've been working on this, making this shift from the 2D kind of an environment into VR and AR kind of an environment. And there's a huge difference between how those sounds, for example, or visuals are being produced. There's a big difference between stereo sounds and binaural sounds that you feel like you're in the environment. And as you're saying, if you close your eyes, it takes a matter of seconds for you to feel like, yeah, I'm walking in New York City.
Right. And with the sounds, this idea of 3D sound, for people that aren't familiar with it, it's the idea that if sound is coming from over there, that corner of the room, it will hit my ear slightly differently, my right ear and my left ear, versus something that's right in front of me or something that's right behind me. And so trying to simulate that digitally by knowing the XYZ coordinates, which is actually a lot of what we do in virtual reality visuals, is, if you go back to the 1980s when I started writing video games. My first game was a tic-tac-toe program on the Commodore 64 and then on the Apple II computers. Back then, if you asked somebody, can you make a fully immersive 3D world like World of Warcraft, which, okay, it's not fully immersive, it's not even virtual reality, but it's a 3D world that you play on your computer. And the answer would be no, there are just too many pixels. There's no way we could render all of that and keep track of all of that. And so what happened between then and now? Well, Moore's law happened, which states that the computing power doubles every 18 months. But more than that, we came up with optimization techniques. We came up with ways to compress the data. And so the rule of thumb was look at your point of view inside the virtual world, inside the 3D world, and render only those pixels which can be observed by your avatar. Right. And so anything that cannot be observed, you don't have to render. And so that was a key optimization technique that allowed for 3D graphics, with games like Doom, back in the 90s, which was so popular that it was bringing college networks down because it was a first-person shooter. And when you turned left or right, it looked like the world moved with you. And if you look at like really old versions of this, Microsoft's Flight Simulator, which was supposed to simulate flying an airplane back in the 80s or 90s when they first came out with it, you could see the lines being rendered across the screen every time you move. So you would turn to the left and you would wait for it to render the scene. today, they have a version of Flight Simulator in beta that is based on Bing Maps, and they took all the maps of the physical world that they could, satellite images, and then they created using AI 3D models of like 1 billion buildings. So you could literally fly over New York City and look down and have it look like the buildings in New York City. And so it's pretty impressive, what's happened, and a lot of this was because of 3D rendering techniques. That's kind of how we got to where we're able to do it. And it's very similar now with 3D sound. There's a lot of work being done on how to reproduce that digitally without having to worry so much about where the physical sound is. And then you add that to the goggles. Now you're in a very immersive type of world.
And this advancement depends on the computational processing power, right? So we're based on silicon right now, but my understanding is that we are reaching the limits of silicon and we have to move to the next mode of computation. How is that going to affect the future of simulating our world, I guess?
Well, we do seem to be approaching a theoretical limit, but what you find is that was thought to be the case before. And so I remember, when I was in business school at Stanford here, just down the road, we had a case study from Intel saying that if they had continued to make processors the way that they were making them, what happens is the processors get smaller and they do more computations. And when they do more computations, it produces more heat. And so the engineers were doing a little analysis that said, okay, as the number of computations increase, how will the heat increase? And they said it was going to be hotter than the sun if it keeps going after a few years. Now, what happened was they came up with different computational techniques. And so optimization was actually the key. Turns out that was the normal, like the 286, 386 Pentium processing. That was the normal track. But there was a parallel group at Intel making processors for laptops, which used a lot less energy and produced a lot less heat, and they used reduced instruction sets, so reduced number of computations. So it's all about optimization. And so I think we're not quite at the theoretical limits and won't be for a while, because people will come up with new optimization techniques and adding other hardware like GPUs. So graphics processing units are pretty common now. And they were invented primarily for video games and entertainment. Like, what do you need graphics for, right? It's to render these kinds of things. Now, if you look at virtual reality headsets, there was a wave back in the 90s where, they had to be hooked up to like very big machines. And then in 2012, I think it was, Facebook bought Oculus for $2 billion. And that was kind of the new resurgence of virtual reality. But one of the problems was, just like with my headset here, which has this wire, you had to be connected to the computer with a wire, because the computer was doing the processing. And so the difficulty with virtual reality is not so much displaying it on a small screen, which, you have the two screens on your eyes. It's calculating what should be rendered in real time, so that when you turn to the left or you turn to the right, it doesn't do what the old flight simulator would do and show you line by line, I'm re-rendering what it might look like. But now, we have the Oculus Quest, which came out last year, and HTC has its own kind of version where you don't need a computer and you don't need a phone. All the computation is done in the headset itself. So we're already seeing kind of standalone virtual reality, which is showing that we'll be able to do more and more computation. That said, there is a lot of work being done on light, right? So the reason we have fiber optics is instead of transferring over copper wires, you basically use light to transmit bits of data. Because in the end, our computation today is all based on bits, right? Ones and zeros. Even how we're talking right now, right? I'm not really talking to you. I'm actually seeing bits that were transferred over the internet, and they're being re-rendered on my side, and I'm being rendered on your side, and one of us is doing the recording, etc. So there's some work being done there, but I think really the next frontier for computing that a lot of people are looking at is quantum computing. And the basic idea there is that instead of using regular bits, so a regular bit has a 1 or a 0 value. You use quantum bits or qubits, which have both a value of 1 and 0. It's called quantum superposition. And this quantum superposition has been one of the biggest mysteries in the world of quantum mechanics. And I talk a lot about it in the book in general, but as we apply it to computation, what it means is that, just like the old story of Schrodinger's cat, right? Where, Schrodinger came up with this analogy because he thought it was just ridiculous what quantum physics was saying. Unfortunately, it's been verified that that's what it's saying, which is that if you have a cat in a box and it has some radioactive material, that after an hour, the cat has a 50% chance of being alive and a 50% chance of being dead. Now, to us, it seems logical that the cat is either alive or it's dead. We just don't know which one. It can't be both, right? It's just one or the other. What quantum physics tells us is that it is both alive and dead until somebody opens up the box and makes a measurement or an
Right.
observation
Right.
of what's inside the box. And so it exists in this weird state of probabilistic reality. And it turns out quantum computers are going to try to use that to say you have a qubit, and suppose you have 50 qubits, right? Each of them can be 0 or 1. Well, that's a pretty big number. It's 2 to the power 50 that you can do. Whereas right now, we have 32-bit or 64-bit processors on our computers, but with that, you basically can do one measurement across all of them, and so it makes it a lot faster. And now it's kind of confusing how it works, but the basic idea is you have it explore all the possible values, right? So if you were to explore all the possible values of 64 bits, you would have to go through 2 to the 64 iterations. But with a quantum computer, you kind of let that run in this probabilistic world, and as you make a measurement, you collapse the probability wave, just like looking at Schrodinger's cat to see if it's alive or dead. And so the idea is that that would result in much faster computers. Now, there's some debate over whether quantum computers are really faster or you can optimize classical computers to do the same things. And so, I think IBM was able to get up to a certain number of qubits now, but it's still early days. It's kind of like 1980 for personal computers when it comes to qubits, right? Or even earlier, like 1960s when most computers were mainframes. So most quantum computers are like these giant things that sit in these super cooled labs using superconductors. The really hard thing about quantum computers is error detection. Right? And turns out this is another basic optimization technique or algorithmic technique we use in software, which is how do you correct errors if you have millions of bits. If 10 of them are wrong, right now, same thing with your picture coming to me. What happens if a couple of those bits gets transmitted wrongly? Well, we can figure out using error correction techniques. Okay, this my hair should be this color. My shirt is black. Therefore, that's probably should be black. It shouldn't be necessarily a bunch of white bits there. And so we use checksums and things like that. And so that's really where a lot of work has to be done still, as well as the physical storage of these qubits is still pretty hard because you have to do it at these very cold temperatures.
Is IBM the leader? Because I know there's one company in Canada, D-Wave, that
Right.
they've been right on top of it for many, many years. And they sold, I think, their machines to Google, the Army company, McDonald's, something. And so I'm interested to know who is the leader at this point in quantum computing.
Well, so D-Wave was one of the earliest companies, may even been the first one to come out with a quantum computer. There's some debate over whether it's a true quantum computer or not, and we won't necessarily get into that. But they're out there. Google has a pretty big quantum computing department. Microsoft actually is spending a lot of money on this as well. And in fact, they're all using and IBM, they're all using different approaches to the physical storage of these qubits. It's kind of as if back in the day when Apple was making a personal computer, IBM was making one, Commodore was making one. Instead of all using silicon chips, one was using Swiss cheese, and one was using copper, and one was using silicon. That's kind of the stage we're at. Is they're still experimenting with what is the best way to physically store these bits. And I think Microsoft had a breakthrough where they were able to do it at normal temperatures, which is pretty important if quantum computing is going to get out there more. You can't require this kind of negative 200 degrees Celsius or whatever the temperature is to store these things. All the big guys are actually running after it right now, and then there's a lot of startups that are working in this space more on the software side, trying to come up with different algorithms that can use. And there's a lot of research. IBM put out a paper, I think last year, stating that there in fact were some algorithms where there was quantum supremacy, which is to prove that a quantum computer can do this way faster than a classical computer. It's not as easy as it sounds, because even though theoretically it can be done, the way you have to go in and measure these bits and collapse that probability wave is kind of tricky, even for like a traditional programmer. Like I was trained as a traditional programmer, you have to think almost very differently to make that transition into quantum programming.
Is the role of a programmer will become obsolete when we move to quantum computation because of all the possibilities that exist, that we inevitably have to rely on some kind of a AI or AGI ultimately?
Well, I don't think it'll become obsolete. I think it'll change from the way we think about it today. I mean, today we're writing procedural software or object-oriented software, and already within the coding world, it's been, let's see, when was the basic programming language was invented? I was probably back in the 70s or 60s, right? So it's been about 50 years that we've had programming, and we're now getting to the no code stage, right? Which is a popular term in programming, which is for somebody who doesn't have to write any code, you just drag and drop things. But people have been talking about that for many years. I remember Steve Jobs making a big deal of this when he left Apple, and he created an X computer back in the 90s that you could just take these objects and put them together. Well, it turns out it wasn't that simple. You still needed to do lots of actual code writing. And so today there's a big trend towards no code solutions, but it's still not there. We still have to write a lot of code. So I think with quantum computing, it'll be different. Like if you go to IBM's website, there's actually a way where you can upload a program, a quantum computing program, up to their computer and have it run on a time-shared basis. So it's kind of like mainframe computers used to be, like back in the days when, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, before they started Microsoft in Seattle or at Harvard, they were working on these mainframe computers, and they would only get them for a certain period of time, and they would submit their programs and wait for them to run and get back the results. So it's kind of in that world, but there's visual representations of these bits. There are languages like Q#, which Microsoft is coming out with, but I'd say it's still a wide open area. I don't think the way that we do quantum programming today will be the way we do it tomorrow.
Right.
So there will probably be some transition. I don't think right away that AGI is going to be able to do computer programming, but we're not even at AGI, so there's a big debate about whether we think we'll get there soon. Now we're getting closer and closer, right? There are these text generation modules that they don't quite pass the Turing test yet. Your viewers may know about the Turing test, which was put forward by Alan Turing back in the 1950s, I think, when he called it the imitation game, and he said if you had a computer behind one curtain and a human behind another, and you're talking, quote unquote, with them. Back then, he was saying you're sending teletype messages. That's how they did it, right? Today, it might be an actual voice conversation, or it might be a chat bot. But if you can't tell the difference between the computer and the human, then that computer has passed the imitation game, and then you're at the point where it's AI, it's intelligent enough, because you can't really tell the difference between one or the other. So we're not quite there yet. Estimates range from a decade to several decades. Most people think we'll certainly get there, within the century. I'm not so sure, personally. I wonder, the argument is, well, if you can't tell the difference between a machine and a human, then we have basically simulated consciousness, right? So this is a big debate that says, what is consciousness?
Wow.
Is a machine
that is a huge point. Yes.
Right? Yeah. So is a machine that acts like a conscious person actually conscious or not? And if we can't tell the difference, does it even matter, right? And so this gets into the debate of, can we take human consciousness and download it into a computer? So, I talked about in this book, The Road to the Simulation Point, there's these 10 stages. And, one of the stages is artificial intelligence, bots that we can talk to. But another stage is this idea of being able to download your consciousness into a computer. It's a very popular topic in Silicon Valley, and people like Ray Kurzweil, who's I think his official title is chief futurist at Google, has been talking about this as a way of achieving digital immortality. But it's not something that we don't fully understand consciousness. So the question is, can we really reproduce it? And is it really you if you reproduce your bits? This is where we overlap with philosophy and religion.
Right.
A lot of guys who talk about the simulation hypothesis, they don't like to talk about religion, they'll talk about philosophy. They'll take it that far, but they won't take it. But if you think, particularly in the Eastern religions, you don't even have to draw an analogy. They basically say that you have a soul or something that exists outside. You download into your avatar, which is our biological avatars in this case, and then at the end of the life you upload back to wherever it was, and there's some information from this lifetime that is stored, and then you go to the next lifetime, you're playing the next avatar, so you have this kind of upload and download of consciousness, right? We don't, again, they don't even define what that is. And it's actually, one of the interesting differences between, say, Hinduism and Buddhism is within Hinduism, you have more of an indestructible soul, right, which is a term we're more familiar with in the West because the Western religions also have this idea of a soul that exists in eternity after you die somewhere else. But, in the Buddhist traditions, particularly what some Buddhist scholars say is that, well, it's more like a bag of karma, right? So the only thing that gets uploaded and downloaded is the information about what happened to you in that life and previous lives. And in Silicon Valley, we would say, well, that's just storing stuff to the cloud, right? The karma is just a bag of information that gets stored somewhere out of sight
Right.
that is not part of the rendered game world, as we call it in the video game world. But yeah, we're touching on very big issues when you get to that point, right?
Well, it seems like it's inevitable to talk about religions and philosophy, and we're reaching a point that everything is kind of coming together, and we have to address all of them and get any kind of information, any kind of a tool we can from wherever to make sense out of basically what we are doing.
Well, that's part of my point in this book, and one of the criticisms I often get is, why did you dedicate a third of the book to talking about consciousness and religion and unexplained phenomena when you should just talk about the computer science and the physics? And for me, it was actually important to realize that, as you go back, humans have been searching for the truth about reality for a very long time, right? And you go back to the Greeks, and Plato had his analogy of the cave, right, which is very popular in philosophy, which is the idea that if we all live in a cave chained to one side and there's an opening, but we can't really look out into the real world, all we see are shadows against the wall. And what happens when somebody goes outside and peeks to see what's out there? Well, first he gets blinded by the light because he's lived in a cave his whole life. But then when he comes back and tries to explain it to the other people, nobody believes him because they think reality is just these shadows that you're seeing on the wall. Within, I think, the Greek traditions, philosophy, science, and religion were not different, right? I mean, Plato's talking about all these things, Aristotle and Pythagoras, they were exploring the mysteries. And so I actually think the goal of religion, the goal of philosophy, and the goal of science is the same, which is to try to understand the nature of the reality that we live in. And I actually think that most religions are founded when somebody peeks outside the simulation, as I like to call it. They peek outside the game, and then they come back and they try to describe what they saw, which is very difficult to do because the base reality, as it's called, may be very different than what we're used to here, right? So the laws of physics really could be just the physics engine of our specific game, as opposed to being the same out there. So it's very difficult to talk about what base reality is like, and that is what creates, kind of the three blind men and the elephant phenomenon, I like to say, with religion, where each one saw a different part of the elephant. They're actually seeing the same thing, but they like to come back and tell it so that, one says it's more like a tree, one says it's more like a house, one says it's more like a snake because of the trunk of the elephant, and that's a phenomenon that we see in our religions. Yeah.
I think it's very profound what you're saying, that even the laws of physics could be just limited to our experience, which, I keep telling people, I call them involuntary baggage, that you identify with your culture and your religion and what your parents have told you, what your society have put upon your shoulder. But really the point is to look at the definition of who the I is. Who are you beyond all of those things? Because these are the things that they have defined you on that basis. It's not you.
Right. Yeah. And I think for a lot of younger people, this idea of the video game is a great way to think about that question. Because if you are an avatar in Fortnite, who does that avatar think he or she is, right? Like, is that really you? What are the laws of physics in that game, right? You can fly, you can do this, you can do that, but you don't really have to go get a car to go places, right? So there's a set of laws, and so that becomes in this model another set of baggage. But by having this idea of saying that there's a player and a player character, it becomes a new way to think about it. And within the world of the simulation hypothesis and simulation theory, there's actually two different versions of this hypothesis. And I like to call it the NPC version and the RPG version. And the NPC version stands for non-player character or non-playable characters, which is the term used in video games for a character that is just an AI that you just interact with inside the game. So you might have the tavern barkeep or the owner of a bank where you're giving some information. And so NPCs have gotten more and more sophisticated visually with games over time. But if you go all the way back to the text adventure games, right, there might be very limited characters. There's characters you can ask very limited things to, and they have a limited dialogue. And even nowadays, a lot of the dialogue is, you still have to just click on choose A or B, right? If you go to like the Game of Thrones or Walking Dead games from Telltale, the guy will say this and you have to choose your response, A or B. So it's still pretty basic. But in the NPC version, we're all NPCs and we're all running on somebody else's computer. And therefore, the world around us is the only world we know. In the RPG version, it's more like what we think of as video games, where we have a player and we have an avatar inside the game, and we are so associated with that avatar, like in the Matrix, we forget that there's a part of us, outside the world. Now, those two are not mutually exclusive. Like when you go into video games today, like MMORPGs, you have both. You have PCs, player characters, and NPCs interacting. And so it's very possible that you have a combination of the two. But for me, both of these versions creates this interesting question of what is consciousness, right? In the NPC version, consciousness is just what the NPC thinks they're doing. Whereas in the RPG version, consciousness exists outside of the simulation. You still don't know what it is, but it's something different. It's observing what's happening within the game and watching the gameplay. Yeah.
I think one of the disconnect for a lot of people about the simulation hypothesis or theory and however they want to talk about it is that, well, who's running the simulation? And the idea is that nobody really needs to run it. If you look at, I'm reading from Wikipedia, also showing it to our viewers, The Game of Life by John Conway, that it's a zero-player game, meaning that its evolution is determined by its initial state requiring no further input. All you have to do is start, basically, and it evolves in the way that it's supposed to evolve, and it's completely based on trial and error and chaos and uncertainty and momentary orders out of them.
Right, and then it evolves based on a certain set of rules.
Yeah.
And in that case, they tend to be very deterministic rules. But it's a big question: who runs the simulation and why, right? And your question of, do you really need somebody to run it? What you really need are a set of initial conditions and a way to get going. One of the ways to think about it is, why do we run simulations, right? Well, we run simulations sometimes to predict the weather, or to predict stock forecasts, or the basic idea of a simulation is you have like populations of fruit flies. Every year you look at it and you say how many fruit flies have died and how many were born in the next generation, and you run. I mean, that's a very non-graphical simulation. It's just a numerical one. But that's one reason. The other reason, though, is we play video games. Why? We play video games to have experiences that we can't have outside the game. Like, I can't fly on a dragon in quote unquote real life, but I can inside a video game, so I can have these experiences that I might not be able to have otherwise. And so I think if you think of an MMORPG, a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, where you have lots of individual people playing the game, like Fortnite or World of Warcraft or one of these other ones, you have millions of people, right? There was a concert in Fortnite last year that had like 12 million people attending it, right? It's like the largest concert ever. Right? And so, it's possible that we are playing the game for our own reasons to have experiences with each other. Or it's possible that we were all just running on a computer somewhere and there's a set of deterministic rules. And those tie right into that dichotomy of the NPC version or the RPG version that I talked about earlier.
That's amazing. That's also how I like to think about the concept of God, quote unquote God, that there is one thing, whether consciousness, it's an endless stream that has always been and always will be, and we are having our subjective experiences of it, and the collection, decentralized collection of that is what I can think of as the concept God or a higher being, higher power, or whatever, which is unknowable, and that's the nature of it. We're just experiencing our own part of it.
Right. So that's, that's an interesting way to think about it. Within the kind of Judeo-Christian line, you have this idea in the Bible that, God created the world in 7 days and said, let there be light, and then basically gave humans free will to decide, what they were going to do, and that there are entities outside the physical world watching us, right? And in the Islamic traditions, they get very specific about this. There's names for the recording angels, right? And in Washington D.C., there's a statue of a recording angel with what they call the Book of Life. In the Bible and in the Quran, they talk about the scroll of deeds, which is a list of every single action you've done in your life. And so, I like to draw the analogy that, well, this was all revealed, written, depending on your beliefs, right? A couple thousand years ago. And if it was done today, we wouldn't use a metaphor of the book, right? And writing down. How would we describe a situation where there are entities watching every move we make, and then they replay it for us at the end of our life, where we have to go back and review everything that was done? Well, we do it all the time in video games, right? We record everything in the 3D world so that it can be replayed, and we stream it on Twitch and we put it up on YouTube. And so, I was involved in a video game company a couple of years ago where we took a 3D game called League of Legends, which is very popular in the esports world. And you play the game on your computer, and you have an avatar, and you're fighting and you're doing all these fun things. And they recorded it, but then they let you replay it by putting on a virtual reality headset. And if you had shot someone, you could actually replay it from their point of view, right? So you could see the gameplay from any XYZ coordinate, but most interesting was to put the coordinates at other players. Well, it turns out, as you explore this world of consciousness and you explore what people have been talking about in the religious traditions, but more recently in near-death experiences, right? I mean, there have been thousands and thousands of cases of near-death experiences since Raymond Moody coined the term back in the 70s, and they're remarkably similar. And many of them have some percentage have this thing called a panoramic life review, which is basically they recall seeing everything that happened in their lives, but seeing it from the point of view of the other people they affected, right? And so there's a friend of mine named Daniel Brinkley. He wrote a book called Saved by the Light. He was basically struck by lightning and had a near-death experience back in the 70s, and he's had several since then. Now, when he was doing heart surgery, etc. But, he said he used to be a bully, and he used to literally beat people up in school, and then he joined the Army and Special Forces and was literally shooting people. He had to go through and relive those experiences from the point of view of the other person, right? And so, if you think about how could that work, right? That's kind of how I like to think about things, being a computer programmer, is how would that work? Well, it wouldn't be that hard if it was a simulation. If it wasn't a simulation, nobody would know how it could be done. But if this world was being recorded and you could replay back any time slice at any time, at any speed, from any position, then that's where the simulation hypothesis intersects very much with what a lot of the religions have been saying, and with this idea of angels being these other entities that are watching us, and then God being the creator of the simulation, however you would define it. So there's a lot of different ways to think about that concept, I think.
Wow. I think this is a good place to read a tweet by Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert. Said, the closer a civilization gets to being able to program a simulated universe, the closer it gets to discovering it is one.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, he's a big proponent of the simulation hypothesis. And, there was a Oxford professor named Nick Bostrom who wrote a paper in 2003 called "Are You Living in a Computer Simulation?" And, he's probably the person most responsible for getting this to go from science fiction to academics talking about it more seriously. He's a philosopher. And, what he said was, if any civilization ever gets there, he said, first of all, there's three possibilities. Civilization never gets to what I call the simulation point, where you can create those simulations. Two, it gets there, but it decides not to create these ultra realistic simulations. Or three, it creates these simulations, but it creates lots of them, right? And so he said, if any civilization in the galaxy ever gets there, they're going to create lots and lots of simulations, because all you have to do is crank up another server in the cloud, right? And he
It's like
estimated
Minecraft.
right, Minecraft. So you just need
Yeah.
another Minecraft server, and he estimated that the number of beings that would be in the simulated universes would be way more than the number of beings in the physical universe. And therefore, if you're a being, then what are you more likely, a simulated being or a physical being? Well, there's more of these than those. So simple statistics says you're more likely one of these than one of those. And so the idea was, if anybody can ever get there, then somebody's already gotten there. And if somebody's already gotten there, who's to say we're not inside the simulation already? And so that is referred to as the simulation argument. That's And so when I started writing my book, I was exploring the technology we would need to get there, and my conclusion was, we'll get there, within 100 years, maybe, right? Definitely. And so if we're going to get there in 100 years, that's like not very long in the overall scale
Hmm.
of the universe, assuming it was a physical universe. So probably a civilization that was 1,000,000 years ahead of us, right? So think of where video games would be in 1,000,000 years. And this is a point that Elon Musk makes, is that if you assume any rate of improvement at all with video games, and you look at today's games, it's funny because I use ping pong as my example that got me really thinking about this, but he makes the point that Pong was
Yeah.
the first widely available computer game in the 70s, which was just like two squares and a dot moving back and forth. And it was from Atari. It was the first widely available video game. And you look at where we've come in 50 years, we're at these ultra realistic virtual worlds, like even with this new version of Flight Simulator I was talking about. And give it another 50 years, where will we be? But give it 10,000 years, suppose it goes more slowly than that, we'll definitely get there. And so if we're going to get there, who's to say we aren't already there inside the simulation ourselves?
Absolutely. So your time frame is 100 years, and you said there are 10 steps to get to the point of indistinguishable simulation. You mentioned AI, which what number of step would that be? AI.
Well, depends on where the AI is, but in my model, it's one of the later steps, because I think getting to AGI will take us a little while. So it's like step 9, 8 or 9. Before that, we're currently at sort of step 4, where we have augmented reality and virtual reality. Now, the difference between those two, with augmented reality, is you wear glasses and you see objects around you placed in the physical world, that aren't really there. And there's a great depiction of this in the HBO show Westworld in the second season, where they would put on these little glasses and then somebody will appear who's not really there, and you can talk to them. And then the next step is kind of photorealistic AR, VR without headsets. So if you think of, like, in Star Wars, in the prequels, right, when Anakin Skywalker is talking to Master Yoda, who's on another planet, he sees a little hologram, or the
Hologram, right?
Princess Leia hologram, right? And so the ability to create these holograms and have them be realistic without the need to put on glasses means that we're starting to blur the lines of distinction between what is a physical
Aren't we
object.
already at the point of hologram though? With do you know Hatsune Miku, the virtual Japanese pop singer?
Yes, that's right. I have heard of
So
some of. You had the Tupac. Was it the Tupac hologram as well?
right, so
That was,
Hatsune
yeah.
Miku, entirely virtual. Her band are all human, but even her voice is virtually generated. And we went to see her show in Toronto,
Uh-huh.
and people are interacting with it as if it's a real artist, and they're very happy to be there. They have the very same experience, and we were given glow sticks that was programmed with the light. It's just insane. So
Right. And
this will
so,
just become
yeah.
more mainstream, you were saying.
Yeah, become more mainstream, and the technology is miniaturized where you can do that. You can take it with you, if you will, right? But yeah, we're on that path. So each of these stages isn't like a single, hey, we're there
Right.
or we're not there. It's more like each of them has a certain percentage of completion, if you will, to get to that point. And with 3D printers are kind of part of that same idea, which is that we can take pretty much any physical object now. I mean, you could take this water bottle and you can print it using pixels. And the only thing that's different is that we don't have all of the materials yet to be able to use pixels. But it used to be every 3D printed object was this kind of gray plastic epoxy. And now you can start to do it with metal and with living human tissue. I mean, they've actually taken blood cells and created skin like what happened with skin that was grafted on before was it wouldn't interface with the rest of your skin because it wasn't really alive in the same way that your skin is alive because it has blood cells in there. And so they were able to print skin at least in the lab and graft it on and have the rest of the body think it was just like a regular skin with the same kind of blood cells using that person's own cells and printing up the skin. And so you're getting biological 3D printers. Now, they're still in the early stages, but once you can do printing of different materials, there's a pretty common scene in the old Star Trek, The Next Generation, where Captain Picard goes into the replicator and says, tea, Earl Grey, hot, right? And it not only materializes the cup, but it materializes the Earl Grey, the liquid inside, and then he takes that and he stirs it and he starts drinking it, right? And so, that's kind of an advanced 3D printer, right? That can print food as well as physical objects. We're not that far away from that. So what we don't have is these brain computer interfaces, and so that's like stage 7 before getting to AI and then downloadable consciousness. And so brain computer interfaces, if you remember in the Matrix, Neo thought he was immersed because when he woke up, Keanu Reeves' character, outside the Matrix, he had a wire going into the back of his head, into his neocortex. And so that's actually an area that's pretty popular these days. Elon Musk has a company called Neuralink, which is putting some chips in the head. And there are other groups that have done research where these chips can be used to help with deficiency or if someone is paralyzed. But BCIs are still in the early stages, I think. And much of them are non-invasive. What they do is they just measure the EEG signals coming out of the brain, and they use those brain waves along with other cues like muscle impulses. There's a company that I wrote about recently, an article about BCI, where they want to speed up your ability to play video games. And so from the time it takes you to say, I want to shoot this person, to pressing the button on the controller, it takes a couple hundred milliseconds, right? And so they detect the electrical impulse in the muscles, and they go and they do it in the game much faster than you could on your own. And so there's a lot of tricks like that that are being used today in BCI. I actually think, this is where this idea of what is the mind, what is the brain, what is consciousness, really comes up. There's actually been some experiments done at PEAR, the Princeton's Engineering Anomalies Research Institute, where they showed they were using quantum random number generators, and the idea is that over time they should be 50-50 if it was just doing ones and zeros or coin toss, right, after 1,000 tries or 10,000 tries. And they found that a human could influence those quantum random number generators based upon what they were thinking. And
Because
they
that's a
found
form of observation, right?
it's a form of
Or
observation,
measurement, better say.
measurement, but they found that if a person sat there with an intention, it would actually change. I mean, the measurement didn't happen necessarily till later, so there's the measurement side of it. But leaving that aside for a second, they found that when they measured it, depending on what the person was thinking, that it would go from 50-50 to like 40-60,
Wow.
which is actually a pretty big variance when
Yeah.
you get to 10,000 tries. I mean, when you're doing 10 tries, that's not a big deal at all. It's like but when you flip a coin that many times, it shouldn't vary that much. And they had peer-reviewed research in that. And there was a company, they made something called a mind lamp. where you can actually think of a color, then they're using quantum random number generators. Now that's a way to try to get that brain computer interface without actually physically, tapping into the physical brain. So I suppose I was talking to somebody the other day and they said, oh, well, that would be a mind computer interface, right? As opposed to a brain computer interface. So, that's all part of kind of this big stage. And I think to get fully immersive, we would have to be able to beam signals into the brain and then take signals out of the brain. And then there's AI, which would be realistic characters. And then there's this idea of downloading consciousness, which is kind of wrapping up our whole consciousness within that. And then we get to the simulation point. And so when I laid these stages of technology out there, I thought about my other research into kind of the realm of consciousness and realized, well, we already have all of these stages of technology in biological form, and we do it every night. They're called dreams, right? Right? We have these simulated worlds. We're completely immersed in them. We're forgetting that there's a part of us outside of that world that is, kind of like Neo laying there, right? We take our input from our mind, and the world changes based on that input. We get things sent to us in very high resolution. It's fully immersive, right? So what we're really learning to do is reproduce this biological technology that already exists. So I thought that was kind of an interesting, realization when I looked at the technology. But yeah, back to your original point, I think 100 years or so is roughly the time frame. Some people think it'll be much earlier. I think that the AGI in particular part will prove more difficult than people think.
Hey, speaking of already existed biological technology, did you look into the effect or influence of psychedelics in the context of simulation hypothesis?
A lot of people have brought that up to me, to say that this is a great way for people to explore it. I haven't personally explored it, but there have been people that have written about it. There's a couple things online about it. I remember I was sitting down with director Oliver Stone, with his son Sean Stone, who is a documentary filmmaker, and he goes, "Oh yeah, all you have to do is try some of these psychedelics, and you'll realize that this is all just a simulation."
Smoke DMT.
Yeah, DMT, exactly, or ayahuasca, right? And you'll
Yeah.
see, you don't need any further proof than that. So I haven't experimented with that, but I have had a lot of people tell me that the experiences they've had there seem like you get into these other levels of reality. And so there's obviously a lot of debate about these things in the scientific community. What's really going on? Same debate as with near-death experiences. What's really going on? Is it just the oxygen in the brain, seeing something that looks like a light? But there's lots of counter arguments there. So I actually put some stock that, this is something that shamans have done for, a long time in many traditions. And they have what they call non-ordinary reality that they visit with the use of psychotropic plants or power plants, as they're called. And in some cases, what I have experimented with is simple shamanic journeying using drumming, right? And so what happens is you use a rhythmic beat, and meanwhile your breathing stabilizes, and you can kind of visit these other worlds, which is the technique that shamans have been using for a long time. And what's really interesting, getting back to this idea of dreams, okay, you might say, well, these are just individual hallucinations, is you can have group shamanic journeys, right?
Right.
So you can have multiple people go and see things and report back, and you can see commonalities between what different people saw, which leads you to believe that there is a reality to this non-ordinary reality. So are there other levels of this reality out there, which is perhaps similar to what people might experience, although much more intensely, I think, with DMT. Yeah.
DMT, my first experience with NN-DMT, not the 5-MeO that comes from the toad, but NN-DMT, I saw massive pyramids and Aztec kind of symbology. The days later, I was like, these people probably had this similar kind of experience that you see similar kind of shaped buildings from Australia to Egypt to Peru and Mexico. And we're not even talking about any of them. We're all aliens.
Right. Right, that's true. There's a lot of alien phenomena and theorizing, particularly on the History Channel, about these things. But I do believe that a lot of ancient civilizations had much better understanding of consciousness.
Yeah.
Right, and that might have led to different states of consciousness. My girlfriend and I visited the pyramids many years ago, and when I was there, I remember having these visions that included things like out of body experiences in places like the pyramids, and kind of led me to believe that okay, there's something going on here that I was either remembering that was related to research that I had done on later after that on out of body experiences and lucid dreaming and what happens when you're dreaming, and that's why I find dreaming to be such a fascinating subject. It's probably one of the oldest subjects for people to write about, right?
Hmm.
Going back to the Bible, because it's so universal, but it's also so complicated. I mean, I've talked about shamanic journeying. I used to study that with a gentleman named Robert Moss, who is an Australian who studied with Aborigines and learned about their ideas of the dream time, and how there's a dream reality and then there's this reality, and what is the real reality. And so this metaphor of the dream was used within Buddhism and other places, and I studied a little bit of Tibetan dream yoga, and the idea was if you can wake up within a dream using lucid dreaming techniques, they have other techniques beyond what we would call lucid dreaming, which is the more modern way of talking about it. But if you can wake up and know that it's a dream and know that there's a part of you outside the dream, then they use that as a wrench, if you will, or a lever to kind of get you to realize the illusory form of the waking reality, that there is another part of you that's outside of that. And so that's why, I spend a whole chapter talking about dreams, not just as a metaphor, which is very much, how it's used, that life is like a dream, or the play, right? In the Hindu traditions, there's the Leela, the grand play, which is a metaphor that Shakespeare used, right? Talking about how
Hmm.
life is a stage and the men and women are merely players on it. But I like to think that if these things were written about today, we would say life is an interactive video game and we're all avatars, within the game. That would be the metaphor that we would use because it's one that makes a little more sense and can bridge the gap between science, technology, and a lot of these spiritual traditions.
Wow. Well, this book, everybody should go and buy it. It's called The Simulation Hypothesis. An MIT computer scientist shows why AI, quantum physics, and Eastern mystics all agree we are in a video game. Before we wrap this up, I don't want to keep you too long, but I can go on for hours, man. This is amazing. this
It's a fun topic,
yeah,
right?
it's the
Yeah.
intersection of consciousness, technology, and philosophy. It's a very interesting area, and a lot of people are very dismissive of it, but I think that is exactly the point.
Right. Well, it makes people think in ways that they wouldn't
Yeah,
otherwise. And I think that's why, a lot of people are talking about it today, but I also think there's a lot of people who normally do not want to talk about philosophy or, the nature of reality, that this is a way in for them to talk about these things.
absolutely. Let's also really quickly talk about your new book that came out in June, I believe, of this year, called Startup Myth and Models: What You Won't Learn in Business School. So what is the summary of the book? What is your thesis, and what is the main message you want the readers to take away from it?
Sure. So this book, I wrote kind of over the last 25 years of working as an entrepreneur, initially as a founder, and then as a board member and investor. And then, the subtitle of the book was supposed to be "What You Won't Learn at Stanford Business School," because that's where I went to, but it was published by Columbia University Press. So they said, well, we can't really take a pot shot at Stanford. But, when I was at business school, what I found was that a lot of what they taught us applied to mature industries and applied to public companies, and but it didn't always apply to startups. That startups needed a different set of models for thinking about how startup markets evolve. And I remember in one of the classes we had literally the guy who wrote the textbook on decision modeling. It was a textbook on how to make extremely complicated Excel spreadsheets, and you would plug in all the numbers, scenario A, B, and C, and then you would see the results, and you'd say, oh, this number is better than that number, which is not as good as this number, so we're going to pick C. And I remember raising my hand and saying, well, what if you just change the numbers on the left, the inputs? He goes, well, then all the numbers on the right change. And I said, well, how do you know what numbers to put in? He said, well, that's where you have to use your gut. as, as a manager, that's why they pay you the big bucks. And turns out as an entrepreneur, spreadsheets are pretty meaningless
Hmm.
because there isn't any history. Now, in big companies, the best bet of the future is the past, right? You look at probabilities of what's happened in the past, but the whole reason there is a market for startups is because the past does not equal the future. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and one of my friends went to work for General Motors. And when the Toyota Prius came out as a hybrid car a few years ago, and the Japanese companies were coming out with hybrid cars quickly, I asked him, why hasn't GM released one? And he goes, well, we did the spreadsheets and it just didn't make financial sense for us, right? And so, one of the main messages in the book is that the startup world is different than the traditional finance world, and that you have to follow a different set of rules. And they're not really rules. You can't systemize everything. Everyone's like, I want to know if I do A, B, and C, 1, 2, 3, then I will have a successful startup, right? And my degree at Stanford is in management science, but management is partly a science, but it's partly an art, right? I mean, there's a lot of interpersonal stuff that happens, and I would say the same with startups. Yes, you can teach you how to put together a deck, how to do a market sizing, how to put together a business plan, how to build a product, how to be a product manager, how to measure results, but you can't guarantee that following any of those steps will lead to success. So there is a formless element, and it's much more like an adventure. So I use the idea from mythology of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. That he looked at all the myths of the world and found that many of them, from the Odyssey to Beowulf, and even more recent ones like The Lord of the Rings or Star Wars, follows these stages. And turns out the entrepreneurial journey can be summarized in these stages, where you have a call to adventure, right? You might refuse the call, you cross the threshold, and then you find yourself in the road of trials, right? Which is when you release the product and you realize, oh my God, things are not going like I thought they would. And you have to get out there and figure out how to get through these challenges that crop up along the way. You have these archetypes like mentors and gatekeepers, just like in the old stories.
It's like a
These
game.
colorful characters. It's like a game. You're right. Yeah, it's like a video game in a way. And then they often have a trip to the underworld, right? I mean, Odysseus literally went down to Hades. In The Lord of the Rings, they went through the mines of Moria. In entrepreneurship, often, there's a life or death, not necessarily your physical life or death, but life or death of the company. And so the book is laid out in the stages of the hero's journey to then find the treasure, which you might think of means selling your company for a lot of money or going public, but really the treasure is, as Joseph Campbell would call it, a magic elixir that you can take back into the normal everyday world. And so it's really about how this journey changes you as a person and how you make decisions along the way. So, that's kind of a long summary of, what this book is about.
That's amazing. It reminded me of something I think Naval Ravikant was talking about, that even if you talk to successful people, how they did it, they can't really tell you. Or the honest ones are not, like, I don't know.
That's right. The honest ones will tell you, that there's a lot more luck involved than just follow steps 1, 2, or 3. And luck may not be the right word, right? I mean, I think it ties very much to, the situation and the personality of the person in that situation. So there's the internal and the external side of these things, and those have to align. And when they do, that leads to, maybe leads to more financial success. But in either way, you will learn a lot about yourself on the entrepreneurial journey. Yeah.
Wow. Well, Riz, we definitely have optimized many years worth of knowledge in this almost an hour, a little more than an hour conversation. Really appreciate it. What's next for you, and where our audience can follow your work?
Sure. So they can go to my website, which is zenentrepreneur.com, or follow me on Twitter at @RizStanford. And I'm working on some additional books right now in the early days, and still doing technology investing and helping entrepreneurs get their game companies and virtual reality companies off the ground. And at some point, I may try to establish an institute doing research on all of these different stages that I talked about for the simulation point, to be a focal point for bringing all this stuff together. But that's probably in the long term.
Yeah. So you're still investing in startups, and people can pitch to you.
Yeah. So, I'm a venture partner at a couple of venture funds. One's called Griffin Gaming Partners, and one's called Ridge Ventures. One does enterprise software, and one does more video games. And so you can connect with me on LinkedIn, or go to my website and contact me there as well at zenentrepreneur.com.
Okay, amazing. Let me ask you the last question that now it has a different meaning to me, because you'll know why. I ask all my guests that if you come across an intelligent alien from a different civilization, what would you say is the worst thing humanity has done? And what would you say is our greatest achievement? But now I'm thinking, how do we know who those aliens are in this simulation hypothesis?
Right. I mean, I'll answer it using superheroes. What happened in the 19th century is we got a much better understanding of the physical universe, and there are stars and there are planets. So what's happened is a lot of the superheroes in the 20th century were like Superman from the planet Krypton, right? So they're from out there and they come here and they have different powers. If you look at superheroes today, like when my nephews, they watch The Flash, right, on TV, they have parallel universes. Supergirl is in her own parallel universe, and you have Earth 1, Earth 2, Earth 3. So just now, this idea of parallel universes and multiple timelines is starting to creep into the popular consciousness. And so, this idea of aliens, it may almost be a 20th century idea that, in fact, if they showed up, it could be that they're piercing through from a different level of reality, which, so it's possible that those people out there who say they've seen UFOs and aliens, and those people who say the Fermi paradox is true and we have no sign of aliens, both could be right in the sense that they're not actually physical aliens coming from other planets. They're actually piercing through from another level of reality. So, my guess is they've already been watching us to a certain extent.
So, what would you say is the worst thing humanity has done, and what is our greatest achievement?
Well, that's a good question. The worst and the best are probably both represented by the world's religions, right? I feel like they have brought out the best of humanity in trying to understand and how we treat others, but they've also brought out the worst of humanity in religious wars and bigotism, bigotry, and in wanting to conquer each other. So I guess I'd give the same answer for both.